Our last speaker is Professor Eileen Sweeney, who's coming from Boston College, and her topic is the morality of the passions from Aquinas to the Renaissance.
Thanks so much. Let me know if you can hear me, if I'm close enough to this thing. Well, I'll just start, but I have some things I'm going to leave out, but they're online, and we can talk about them if you're interested. It just got too long. Okay, so in this essay, you'll be able to see the outline of why it's too much. I will consider two 13th century views, that of Aquinas and the Franciscan Peter John Olivi, before moving to Occam and some aspects of the later scholastic views in Suarez, and in a late 15th century commentary on Aristotle's Ethics. And then lastly, to two Renaissance views, that of Marsilio Ficino and Michel de Montaigne. What I want to explore here is the question of whether the passions are or have a role to play in moral action. But I want to do that by focusing on whether and in what sense the passions or emotions are taken to be integrated in our humanity. Though the early Christian fathers and the Stoics differ in a sense on whether or not human beings are able to master and resist the passions, the Stoic sage successfully resists, but the desert father struggles against the forces. What they share, in some sense, and I know the Stoics won't like this, so I say in advance, that the passions are the source of a moral failure and that they are wrong, but also that in some sense, the passions are not me. That is, they're a lower or an external, in the case of the fathers, demonic urge that drags us away from our human nature. So I'm going to do a very brief stage setting about the Church Fathers and the deadly sins tradition, like 3 sentences, and then I'm going to talk about Aquinas and Olivi. So the middle parts, so whether Occam and Suarez and the Coimbra commentary, I have slides to sort of summarize those arguments, but I'm going to leave them aside, but I'm happy to answer any questions. They're sort of countervailing tendencies to this sort of integrated passions, which I argue all of the 4 main figures that I'm going to talk about have. So anyway, it's at least 2 papers, so I'm going to leave one of them out for you. Okay. So there's a strong tradition in early Christian thought which finds the seed of bad actions in the passions which are themselves understood as sinful. According to Silvano Vecchio's historical study of the passions, the ancient view of the Church Fathers, Cassian, Gregory the Great, and so forth, influenced by Stoicism and Gnosticism, is that passion equals vice. Cassian organizes the vices around the division of the soul into the concupiscible and irascible appetite and the passions of each one. Cassian expresses fear that about any small expression of desire as setting loose the unrestrained desire for more, pleonexia. And the sins in that context take on the character of demons, spirits, forces which come in to take over the soul. You get the same thing in Gregory the Great. In this tradition, the moral life is essentially a struggle against evil, expressed by personifying the 7 sins as forces of evil attacking either the person or the virtues. And despite Augustine's more complex position on the passions, the tradition of the deadly sins and their identification of passion with sin continues in the 12th and 13th century. The Franciscan Summa Hellensis posited a faculty of sensualitas, added to the philosopher's division of the soul into the rational, concupiscible, and irascible. And sensualitas is a corrupted form of sensuality, which in rational creatures should be subject to reason. So it's explicitly a consequence of the fall. For the Franciscan writers of the Summa Hellensis, the fall changes the psychological structure of human beings, driving the emotions of the concupiscible and irascible appetites, in themselves common to humans and animals, away from control by reason. Another way passions and sin are brought closer together is in the mapping of the 7 deadly sins, and there you have them for you, onto the parts of the soul. John of Rupella's Summa Divitis, about 1240, connects the deadly sins to the 3-part division of the soul into vegetative, sensitive, and rational. And the Summa Hellensis maps the sins onto the concupiscible and irascible appetites. So the irascible contains pride, envy, and anger, and the concupiscible, greed, lust, avarice, and sloth. While John of Rupella does not identify sin with the powers of the soul or with the passions, nonetheless, on his view, original sin corrupted all the human faculties, including sensuality, making sinful even those first movements of the soul arising outside the control of reason in the passions. I suppose a version of Stoic propasiones. The problem of sin or vice is the problem of the soul's union with a weak and corrupted body on this view. The definitive break with the view that the passions are sin or vice is found in Thomas Aquinas, both in his subordination of the 7 deadly sins to the sins or vices organized by Aristotle's table of the passions, in which the passions are neither themselves virtuous or vicious, but explained in psychological terms. Aquinas' shifting of the picture happens in 2 different moments. The first is an understanding of the passions mapped onto the 3 stages of Aristotelian natural motion. And here is my attempt at a diagram. Luckily, the bits didn't move. The second is a move beyond Aristotle to a Neoplatonic movement to union with the good. Natural motion for Aristotle begins first in the inclination toward an end contained in nature. Second, there is the movement toward the end. And third, rest or fulfillment in that end. Aquinas takes these 3 movements and generalizes them. The original inclination of nature toward the full actualization of its form, the acorn's movement to become oak tree, becomes the movement all natures have toward good and away from evil. And he then maps 11 major passions onto the basic trajectory. So we heard some of this before. So love is the inclination toward the good, desire is the movement toward it, joy or pleasure, the resting in the good possessed, hatred is the disinclination to evil, aversion, the movement away from evil, sorrow or pain, the resting and subjection, in subjection to evil. Those are the concupiscible passions, directly moving from evil and toward good. The passions of the irascible appetite still have the basic orientation and movements toward good and away from evil, but as difficult to attain or hard to avoid, again, as we heard. Hope, then, is the movement toward it as an attainable but arduous good, despair, the turning away from the unattainable good, fear, the movement from the arduous future evil, shunned rather than defeated, daring, the tendency toward evil in order to defeat rather than be subject to it. And anger, finally, is the movement toward evil and revenge for an evil suffered. In Aquinas, all the passions are in some way reducible to the tendency of things to seek what is suitable to their nature and flee the contrary. All are movements which presuppose a likeness or aptness towards that which they tend. In this way, he uses the model of nature and its fulfillment as a way of affirming the passions as naturally good when directed toward real rather than apparent goods. In the course of the 24 questions, filling in this trajectory, a long list of commonplaces indicating the perversity, irrationality, pettiness, and ambivalence of human passion are included as objections and questions. So Aquinas considers the misplaced hope of young men and drunks, and the contrary in the old and experienced, wonders why fear makes men take counsel. And you will recognize these observations from Aristotle's Rhetoric, one of the last Aristotelian texts to make its way into the medieval curriculum. Aquinas adds to Aristotle his own observations of human behavior at its most problematic. Why, he asks, the apparently contradictory sweetness of sorrow? Sorrow, he notes, is sometimes assuaged not by pleasure, but rather by tears, as well as by sleep and baths. And pleasure all too often does not seem to end with repose and satisfaction, but leads to greater desire or even distaste. How is it that we take pleasure in change rather than rest, in the overcoming and contradicting of others rather than harmony? There's a question. And why do we love more in the absence of the beloved? Why should, as ecclesiastics tell us, quote, the wise spend more time in mourning than rejoicing? Despair sometimes moves us to act, and hope to complacency. And why do we fear God as well as sin? Why do we even fear, Aquinas asks, someone in advance of FDR, fear itself? Aquinas explains apparently irrational attractions, aversions, and mixed and inconsistent responses by separating out the strands of opposing and incongruous passions, attempting to save the rationality and intelligibility of the passions. So he divides the pleasures of grieving into the attraction to the loved object, which gives or anticipates pleasure, and the aversion to its loss, which having occurred is mourned. The source of pleasure in overcoming and contradicting others, he explains, is not the evil done to others, but a good to oneself in the appreciation of one's superiority in overcoming others. The strategy is to make coherent and intelligible the apparent inconsistencies and perversities of human passion, even as he ever so deftly points toward the object that would put an end to all inconsistency and perversity. When considering the infinity of human desire, Aquinas quotes Jesus' response to the woman of Samaria, quote, "Whosoever drinketh this water shall thirst again." When Aquinas considers whether the passions are morally good or evil, he argues against the Stoics and with the Peripatetics that passion is not an evil, not a disturbance of the soul or nature, unless unchecked by reason. But he goes further, following Augustine, arguing that any passion is good in itself if it turns to what is truly good and tends away from what is truly evil. This Augustinian claim is used time and time again as the pivot to shift the orientation of the discussion toward love of the good. For Aquinas, love is the cause of all the other passions, and always that in terms of which they are analyzed and explained. Quote, "The end is the good desired and loved by each one. Hence it is manifest that every agent of whatever kind does every action whatever from love of some kind," end quote. Aquinas' response about whether passion increases or decreases the goodness of an act is that passions which follow the choice and the act add to the goodness of the act, both in signifying the intensity of right willing and as helping the will to act promptly and easily because supported by passion. Only passions which precede rational deliberation and choice can undermine the act. Thus, it is not just the moral orientation of the passions to the love of God, but the moral value of the passions felt appropriately, having a value qua feeling, because the correct response to what is right or wrong, and as enhancing the correct response to what is right or wrong, and as enhancing the right action. Even as he argues against the conclusion that every pleasure is good, Aquinas notes, quote, "Since pleasure is the repose of the appetite in some good, if the appetite reposes in that which is good absolutely, the pleasure will be pleasure absolutely and good absolutely," end quote. Against not just the Stoic rejection of pleasure as good, but also the Platonic view that no pleasure can be the greatest good, Aquinas affirms that the greatest good of human being is in the pleasure or joy in the last end. However, alongside the emphasis on the model of nature to understand the passions, an account of love and the passion begins to emerge, which is less contained by the Aristotelian model of moving toward becoming actually what one already is potentially. There is a subtle shift from the movement toward fulfillment or completion of a thing's nature to movement toward the good, which orients us toward not just what is contained in, but is beyond nature. The shift becomes seismic in the question concerning the effects of love. There. Merely the title of the article tells us that we have left Aristotle behind to join Dionysius and the Victorines in the 12th century. Aquinas asks whether union, mutual indwelling, the ecstasy of lover and beloved, the zeal and wounding of the lover are effects of love, and he considers how wounding can take the forms of melting, enjoyment, languor, fervor. All that language comes from the Song of Songs and is taken as describing the effects of seeking intimate knowledge and satisfaction, possession and identification of feeling with the beloved. The question as a whole is grounded in those two sources, the Song of Songs and Pseudo-Dionysius, the very same sources Hugh of St. Victor and the Victorines in the 12th century fit together for this new account of affectivity that Aquinas follows. In these passages, Aristotelian orexis, directedness toward the end and fulfillment of nature, is superseded by mystical love, in which the object is outside and exceeding the self, in which the aim is union with that other, not fulfillment of the self, or rather, I suppose, fulfillment of the self in union with that other. Love, Aquinas explains, is ecstatic in three ways. Let's see, I forgot if it's here, or maybe it was there. Sorry, I have a sort of paraphrase there about the three kinds of ecstatic. As the beloved dwells in the lover's mind. Second, in concupiscence, not being satisfied with the good one has and seeking a good outside oneself. And finally, most completely in what he calls the love of friendship, where, quote, affection goes out from itself absolutely, wishing and doing good for the friend for his sake. Aquinas also argues that a passive love based in the sensitive appetite for God is more God-like than rationally grounded dilection. So here's the quote there. It is possible for a man to tend to God by love, being as it were passively drawn by him, more than he can possibly be drawn to him by his reason, which pertains to the nature of dilection, end quote. Aquinas thus repeats the Hugh of St. Victor claim, valuing the affective over the cognitive, receptivity and passivity over activity, but goes further in expressing that view, not in the context of mystical experience, but in the account of the passions of the sensitive appetite. While clearly Aquinas takes the sensitive or bodily appetite to be inferior to the higher intellectual appetite, the desire for non-bodily goods, because always needing change and replenishment, but by outlining the positive character of appetite in general in the account of the sensitive passions, and by elevating them by association with mystical union, he gives them a value and a place in human life beyond what is found in Aristotle. He even, as in this case, finds aspects of the sensitive appetite, its passivity and non-rational nature, as being more fitting for the love of God because God as object exceeds our rational capacities. Insofar as Aquinas is adopting an Aristotelian account of the passions are more or less neutral, able to be moderated and directed toward the true rather than apparent good under the tutelage of reason. But even what I described as the first change Aquinas makes to the prevailing 13th century view, mapping the passions onto Aristotelian motion, Aquinas is aligning them with a positive motion toward good and from evil. Human natural inclinations are toward our natural fulfillment and are thus good because aimed toward the good. To be moved toward a higher extrinsic good is the good, and not to have those passions, not to be so moved, is the worst kind of failing. Aquinas' account finds a positive place for passivity rather than self-mastery, and ecstasis rather than imminent Aristotelian natural fulfillment, for pleasure as the highest good. Of course, pleasure is the highest good only when it is found in the highest good. Becoming the receiver rather than agent and aiming at an extrinsic good likewise holds only when the object is the final supreme good. Nevertheless, in this section on the passions of the sensitive appetite, we can't forget, Aquinas chooses to assimilate the passions to the highest desire and fulfillment rather to explain them physiologically or materially. The desires of the passions are swept up into the aspirations of the whole person, rather than made a merely physical, non-human impulse, or spun off as distorted or sinful responses. The psychology of the passions, driving toward good and away from evil, is the psychology of the whole person. All right, so here is a very different, but also, I think, quite unusual view about the passions. And that is from Peter John O'Leary. So Peter John O'Leary is a Franciscan who was writing in the generation just after Aquinas and Bonaventure, and he puts forward one of the most original accounts of the emotions I've come across, and I've been trying to dig out these sort of medieval to modern views. His account is completely different from Aquinas, taking its starting point from Aristotle's rhetoric rather than the ethics. I group O'Leary with Aquinas, if you will, as another way of integrating the passions as fully and essentially human, because he defines the emotions, as you will see, as felt for and by beings who are free, and insofar as they are free. For O'Leary, instead of freedom making the emotions as natural, non-chosen responses, either contrary to or irrelevant to moral choice, or irrelevant in moral choices that we make freely, and that's the view taken by William of Ockham, who comes just after, the emotions we have are proof that the will is free for O'Leary. In his discussion, O'Leary does not say whether or not having these passions is moral or immoral, sometimes moral and sometimes not. And I've been trying to dig out the rest of O'Leary's moral theory, which is a little complicated. But I can tell you what I don't know, if you're interested. In this discussion, O'Leary, sorry, I already read that. So what is interesting is that he develops his account of the passions as thoroughly human rather than not human. They are neither merely animal nor characteristic of debased or fallen humanity. A consequence of this reordering of the passions or emotions is an account of the emotions as fundamentally social, experienced for, toward, and with other free beings. So I'm going to take you on just a sampling of O'Leary's definitions and their indications, many of which I think there are some elements that will bring to mind modern views of the passions as far from O'Leary as Hobbes, Rousseau, and Hume. So I just have a few of these. Explaining anger, so here we come back to anger from this morning. O'Leary notes that we get angry not at animals or anything without free will, but only at a person, quote, and I have too much bolded, but part of the quote that's bolded there about anger, who has done what they ought not, or what they could have avoided or guarded against, end quote. Anger, then, for O'Leary is the opposite of a kind of natural or even physical or animal response to pain or suffering, which is kind of the way Aquinas places anger. It's retaliation for an evil suffered, even though it's not animal. But so this is very different. Free will is at the center of this, as it is for Aristotle, as we heard this morning. So it's thoroughly in the realm of beings with free will who choose and are seen to choose their actions as the essential feature of the passions we feel. Anger is how I respond when someone chooses to act toward me in ways I would not choose for myself. And mercy is the emotion that grieves for and wants to redress that same deprivation of someone else's proper dignity. What holds for anger holds for all the emotions for O'Leary. What grounds human interaction is the free will of the parties who recognize, fail to recognize, or impede the free will of others. Though O'Leary mostly follows Aristotle's listing of the passions from the rhetoric, he makes, wrong way. He makes some interesting additions. Are those the ones I want? Let's see. Wait, did I screw it up? I might have. Oh, sorry. So I still want to be here. The 7 pairs I'm getting at are listed at the bottom there. Sorry. So he uses Aristotle's list, but adds 2 more complex pairs, what he calls reverence and mastery, or dominatio, which is hard, an important Franciscan concept, but hard to translate, and fear or concern on one side versus what he calls heedlessness or laziness. These pairs are both social, the first pair directly so, concerned with how we see ourselves as related to others. We either subject ourselves to or have reverence for another as being worthy of being placed above us in some sense, as opposed to having a sense of dominion or mastery, not necessarily over another, but as not being controlled by another. Hence, O'Leary glosses dominatio as invincible and blessed freedom. The other contrasting pair, fear and confidence, is glossed as solicitude and responsibility or concern, on the one hand, as opposed to a kind of carefree lack of urgency or need to act. This pair suggests notions of fear and confidence in social contexts, either feeling the need to act or not act for and with others. On subservience or reverence, now I think I do need the next one. Sorry. On subservience or reverence, contrasted with dominatio, O'Leary argues that we only feel subservience and reverence if under an obligation. But obligation requires freedom, both in the one who feels reverence and in the one who receives it. Without freedom, it's not reverence but coercion. And unless the one reverenced is a free being who chooses their role freely, he says, there can be no obligation to them, for they are not the source of the thing we recognize as higher than us. So you see how thoroughly he's weaving this idea of free choice into the emotion and how we feel them. Similarly, O'Leary's account of shame and glorying, he says, are felt only in regard to those who are either loathed or honored because of the things they have chosen, things that are theirs in the strong sense of being, and here uses the language, under their rule or dominion. So he has the same, I'm not going to read this one, he has the same account of the role of free choice in the possibility of friendship, but it's not directly an emotion. So O'Leary seems to have the same kind of voluntarist notion of ethics, right? So that my actions are correct only when they're directly chosen. But that unlike Occam, that doesn't lead him to sort of downplay the role of the emotions. That for Occam, the emotions have no moral role to play whatsoever. Whereas for O'Leary, they're centrally connected to my free choice and the way I function as a human being. So it's just interesting to see. So Occam has no interest in the particular passions. There's no particular discussion. He doesn't list them all. He doesn't do a sort of version of Aquinas' account because they essentially don't matter. That is the choice that's free. Those emotions or even habits can be formed in any way whatsoever, but they don't coerce or force or direct my action. It's always the free choice in the end. Now, so the other text that I looked at, this is the Coimbra commentary on Aristotle's ethics. I was looking for somebody who was going to be influenced by Aristotle's rhetoric the way Olivi is. But in an interesting way, the Coimbra commentaries, which were probably known, they were known by Descartes, he mentions them at some point, but we don't know whether he had these. But the account of Aristotle's ethics simply inserts the Aquinas's category of the 11 passions into the Aristotelian text, as if it were there. So it's the, I was like, what? There are certain changes, and I can talk about them. There's certain ways in which there are kind of Stoic and medical elements that make their way into the commentary, even as they're inserting Aquinas's categories of the 11 passions right there. And so you see some of those. Again, we can talk about these. And the same, I'm going to skip over the details on Suarez. But Suarez also seems to follow Aquinas. But the more you read him, the more you're like, this doesn't make sense. Because it's mostly voluntarism and mostly the ways in which the kind of conflict is not between passions, but between reason and the passions. And it's very far from an Aristotelian picture of political or monarchical rule of the passions. It becomes a kind of battle. At one point he uses this language that the passions extort consent from the will. So it's a very sort of adversarial setup that doesn't sound like what Aristotelian virtue is supposed to look like. Okay, so now we get to see, those were all the pages that I didn't read, so that's a good thing. So here's Marsilio Ficino, which in a way I would like philosophers to be more interested in, so maybe we can try. So Marsilio Ficino's account of human love in his commentary on Plato's Symposium is a source that roots human love at its deepest level of being and at the center of emotional life. The text is not a commentary, but a rewriting of the 7 speeches of the dialogue from Ficino's Christian Neoplatonic perspective. Ficino turns love into a cosmic and universal drive, both there from the origin of things and thus spread to everything that exists, picking up on, but taking much further, the Neoplatonic turn taken by Thomas Aquinas. The supreme author of the universe first creates all things, its goodness, attracts them to itself through beauty, and third, perfects them through justice. So divine beauty generates love, that is, the desire for itself in the whole world. Thus, when Ficino's speakers get to human love and desire, it is placed within this cosmic love, the love of all things to return to their source. While the original Symposium makes a strong distinction between heavenly and earthly love, Ficino's rewrite describes only one kind of love that finds its expression throughout the cosmos. He claims that the human lover does not desire just, and that's the quote finally that I have there, doesn't desire just this or that body, but that in love he admires, desires, and is amazed by the splendor of the celestial majesty shining through bodies. For this reason, lovers do not know what they desire or seek, for they do not know God himself, whose secret flavor infuses a certain very sweet perfume of himself into his works. Not known for spare language. This is followed by a distinction between 2 Venuses. The first, he says, embracing the splendor of divinity in herself, that then transfers to a second Venus, who in turn transfers Venus, the spark of that splendor, into the matter of the world. So again, it's not a Manichaean 2, but a kind of emanation out. 2 things to note here. Ficino, oh, sorry, that's what I just said. No, I can blah, blah, blah. So the desire to contemplate beauty and the desire to contemplate beauty and the desire to procreate are virtuous in the sense that they seek the divine image. Philosophy and the practice of justice, as well as physical procreation, are seen as forms of eternal love. In procreation, he says, we are continuously driven to create some likeness of that celestial beauty in the image of a procreated offspring. Ficino rather pointedly rewrites Aristophanes' explicitly sexual myth into an allegory of innate versus infused light. In place of Zeus's cutting of the circle people in half, the soul abandoned its infused light, and then its which is exclusively aroused by a natural innate light. So that's the split. Ficino's version of the split soul is the fall of pride. The soul, however, with the right education, is prodded to recover this infused divine light. The appetite to recuperate the inner light is what he calls true love, by which the soul seeks to recover its divine other half. The beauty of the world is the splendor of the divine countenance shining in three mirrors. I think I have this, or at least some of it. Three mirrors, in angels, the soul, and the body of the world, which Ficino calls universal beauty and the impulse toward universal love. Ficino explains that the passion and suffering of lovers is there because the splendor of the divinity shining in the beautiful, compelling the lovers to marvel, to be afraid, and to worship. The strength of the passion is because they are responding to more than physical beauty. It leads to a kind of loss of self as they abandon themselves for the beloved. So this is the next quote there. They sigh because they are losing themselves, because they are destroying themselves, because they are ruining themselves. They rejoice because they are transferring themselves into something better, end quote. That love is born of poverty and plenty, the view expressed by Diotima's original speech, is explicated by Ficino as a kind of ecstasis, the soul going out from itself. The soul gives up its natural home for service of the beloved. It gives up serving its own body to, quote, leap across into the body of the beloved, end quote. In a way not found in the original Symposium's account of love, Ficino emphasizes the mutuality of love. Such that each gives himself to the other in order to receive the other. In reciprocal love, quote, there is only one death, but a double resurrection or reliving. For he who lives dies in himself once when he neglects himself. He revives immediately in the beloved when the beloved receives him in loving thought. He revives again when he finally recognizes himself in the beloved and does not doubt that he is loved, end quote. The reciprocal character of love is also universal, not just among humans. So all the parts of the world are works of one artist. Quote, and each like other in being and life are bound to each other by a reciprocal love, making love, quote, the eternal knot and link of the world, end quote. This is the opposite of a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. Ficino concludes that no part of the world hates the other. The lamb does not hate the wolf, but merely wants to survive. Man does not hate man, but the vices of man. For Ficino, though we seek a higher and more perfect object, what we seek is really in the things we love. The soul's search for love is neither silly nor misguided. It is not, as we might characterize the wounded half-circle people in Aristophanes' myth, or in Alcibiades himself, as the old country song goes, looking for love in all the wrong places. It is a serious and high-minded, not because and to the degree that it steps on the ladder away from the world, but insofar as it finds and seeks what is really in the world, in the things it loves. Beauty is there because an interior goodness is given by God. A ray of this splendor goes out through the eyes and into the soul. The end of this journey is not the ascent of a ladder through the clouds and utterly beyond the world of things. Rather, as Ficino writes, quote, in this life we shall love God in all things, so that in the next we may love all things in God. For living in this way we shall proceed to the point where we shall see both God and all things in God, and love both him and all things which are in him, end quote. Moreover, he adds, we worship things in God in order to, quote, surround ourselves with him above all others, and in loving God we shall seem to have loved ourselves, end quote. Thus neither we nor things disappear in the union with God, but are loved in God and recovered by God. All right, I want to say a few things about Michel Montaigne, because this Ficino has gotten all too sweet, and believe me, there's no sweetness in Montaigne. Though Montaigne and Ficino is perhaps an unexpected pairing, and they do have in many ways completely opposing views. For Ficino, love is the root of all passions. It's cosmic and realist in the sense that love is a response to real features of the objects of passion and is thus intelligible. For Montaigne, the passions are not just individual, but idiosyncratic, capable of being arbitrarily related to their objects and consequently not intelligible. Further, Montaigne completely disengages the passions from morality, such that the problem of morality for Montaigne is not the control or disappearance of the passions. Though Montaigne takes a rather worldly and playful perspective on the diversity and even perversity of the passions, noting the strange behavior that leads us into, unlike the Stoics, he values those feelings as feelings in all their diversity and perversity. As we will see, Montaigne thinks his own propensities towards certain passions, even when they lead him into nonsensical actions and attitudes, are preferable, at least to him, and more interesting than if he were simply average or moderate or practical. Thus, Montaigne makes the passions integral to his humanity, expressive of his individuality, and crucial to the enjoyment of his life. It's true that many of Montaigne's particular claims or observations would be perfectly at home in Seneca or Cicero, but the case I want to make is that despite the Stoic notes Montaigne plays, he is weaving them into his own distinctive melody. He starts from the premise that we have the power to choose whether to experience things as pleasurable or painful. So far, the Stoics. Montaigne takes, however, as evidence for the ability to reconfigure our experience, the diverse responses different people have to the same thing. If the real, painful, or pleasurable, good or evil of the objects forced itself upon us, then we would all have the same responses. We have the same tools, essentially the same bodies with the same capacities. That we have diverse opinions must be then because the soul, not the body, is variable across times and from individual to individual, and is also utterly autonomous. The soul, he says, is variable in all its forms and subject to herself and to her own empire, all things whatsoever. There is neither reason nor force nor prescription that can anything prevail against her inclination and choice, end quote. She has, Montaigne goes on to say, quote, many thousands of biases at her disposal, end quote. Unlike animals, we have freed ourselves from the governance of moderate nature to, quote, give ourselves up to the rambling liberty of our own fancies. He counsels not distance from the body, but a kind of engagement in a firm stance of opposition. He crafts the Platonic view, distancing oneself from the body as a kind of withdrawal from battle, leaving the enemy to win. And though he cites examples of those who, given a choice, choose death, the examples are not morally uplifting stories of those choosing death over compromise of high moral principles, but those who, for example, choose to die rather than, for example, be married to a woman whose nose or chin they dislike, or of women who allow their skin to be flayed for the sake of a better complexion. Though reason can be, it is not universally an aid to regulation of our experience of pleasure and pain. Reason acts, and not well, in Montaigne's view, to lessen, quote, the number and sweetness of those pleasures that are naturally our due, just as she, quote, artificially disguises and tricks out the ills of life, end quote. Even as reason plays this positive role in lessening the experience of pain, it does not do so by relaying the true significance of pain and loss, but by tricking us into not noticing or caring. Even though Montaigne asserts the power we have of our own happiness unconditionally, still he characterizes as monstrous humors those with pure stoic or apathetic responses to, say, for example, the death of children. He imagines that Cato couldn't, as he plucked out his own bowels, have been without any horror, and that, moreover, he must have felt pleasure and delight in his own noble action. Virtue is a kind of resistance, having strong passions, but also heroically resisting them, and also getting a kind of pleasure from one's heroic act. Let the philosophers say what they will, the thing at which we all aim, even in virtue, is pleasure. And in this chapter, devoted to the exploring Socratic maxim that to study philosophy is to learn to die, Montaigne observes wryly that an easy death seems to be one where we are already old and in pain, when life is less pleasurable, and not one, that of the Stoic sage who faces a death in the prime of his life. For the path from uneasy being to none at all is easier than from a state of flourishing strength. So nature contrives to lead us to death, small step by small step. Though in the context of the essay, Montaigne is making broadly Socratic and Stoic points that we must not fear death, his account of it places pleasure rather than honor at its center. That we must get over death is counseled because it makes life itself easier and more pleasurable. So I have some more examples from Montaigne, but I'm going to skip them and just make a few remarks about what I think all of this might perhaps add up to. I'm not sure. I've used this categorization of theories of the passions of my own making, integrationist and non-integrationist, partly because in the larger project I'm working on, Medieval to Modern Theories of the Passions, one of the themes I'm tracing is the view of the passions or emotions as forms of passivity or receptivity. Insofar as the passivity or receptivity of the passions is viewed negatively as something to be avoided or controlled, it is often a kind of feminization of the passions. That feminization of the passions is largely in service of the project of the masculization of virtue as mastery and control. And in the more extreme formulations of some of the church fathers, it becomes almost a kind of splitting in the psychological sense of the passions off from the self. We have in Aquinas and Ficino, though more measured in Aquinas, the embrace of receptivity and passivity as an openness to transcendence, to the divine, as opposed to the control or mastery of the earthly or natural. Olivi's integration or humanization of the passions doesn't involve them in becoming part of the cosmic reditus of Neoplatonism, but rather their very nature being expressions of and proof of free will, such that whether we direct them well or badly, they are fully human responses to the world, not merely bodily phenomena. Occam illustrates the dominant effect of the centrality of will to human anthropology on the passions as pushing them out of moral relevance in a way that seems to anticipate Kant. Instead of the highest act of human virtue being the apotheosis, literally, of natural desire, then the highest moral action becomes a kind of transcending, for Occam and others, a kind of transcending of natural tendencies. I find in Suarez and the Coimbra commentary a kind of ambivalence on this question in a way I think is weighed down both by the theological tradition of the fathers and the growing neo-Stoicism of early modern thought over against the Neoplatonic path of divinization. Montaigne here, at least, represents a very idiosyncratic path toward integration of the passions in his interest and enjoyment and even celebration of them, not as expressing the direction toward God in any way, but in all their irrationality, perversity, and unpredictability. I have some things I could say about Descartes, but I'm not going to, about how this goes forward. Thanks.